Kapag di nagtigil ng katuturuyan, baka putulin ko ang titingin.
Tumahimik muna kayo.
In our fight against communism.
Buhay ang NPA!
Master na to siya sa traffic lang.
Motherfucker! Alisin mo yan! Adik ka ba?
My God, I hate drugs.
Magandang gabi po. I'm Roby Alampay, greeting you on behalf of PhilDocs, that's the Filipino Documentary Society. Welcome po to Daang Docu, the home of Philippine documentaries. Daang Docu is brought to you by media partners GMA Network, ABS-CBN, Rappler, Inquirer.net, Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, and Probe Productions. Tonight's show is co-presented and will be cross-posted by Engage Media, Pelliculove, Rappler, ANCX, and the University of the Philippines Film Institute. So ano po pag-uusapan natin? Pag-uusapan natin today the state of journalism in the Philippines. As a journalist, and I speak for myself, although actually no, I speak for all of us. I'm pretty confident in saying this. We're in crisis. We are all in crisis. The press, journalism, media in the Philippines is in crisis. Probably one of the fairest things you can say, on the other hand, is yeah, but we've always been in crisis. So this is not necessarily just to attribute to one regime or one moment in time, but there's a lot of the realities that exist that have always been there. A crisis of relevance, a crisis of freedom, as we said, a crisis of trade, where news is molded in the strange new world of analytics, formats, platforms. And if you think that's not driving us up the wall, there is a crisis in society, where delivering the news has become a battlefield where you face network shutdowns, cyber libel, confiscations, misogyny, and too many dead journalists in its wake. And then on top of all of that, there's this.
Ang inyong franchise mag-end next year. If you are expecting na ma-renew yan, I'm sorry. You're out. I will see to it that you're out.
Press freedom. Press freedom, kayo yung number one magnanakaw, ayaw nyo sa uli yung propiedad, press freedom.
Inquirer, you've never been fair. I know that it's supposed to be antagonistic, but fair, bastos kayo, pati ABS-CBN.
Tangina itong Time Magazine na to. Nilagay ako doon sa mga despot. Hindi naman ako, diktador ba ako? Since when? Since when did I send somebody to prison for just talking against me? Sige nga.
Kasama lang yan ng kapilyuhan niya. Sabi naman ng mga fellow bedans, talagang pilyo yan.
Just because you have the power of, press freedom, the issue here is not press freedom. The way your masters, the elite, yung may-ari niyan, and you are not even constitutionally allowed to go into the media with the pretext of yung depository. What kind of a salam of it is that?
Kaya ako mamatay, mahulog yung eroplano, putang ina. I am very happy. Alam mo bakit?
sabi ko, without declaring martial law, I dismantled the oligarchy that controlled the economy of the Filipino people. Yung mukha kayong pera, kakapal ang mukha ninyo, kayong taga-media. You know, you want to know my sentiments? Fuck you.
So welcome po to our reality check series. Once again po, ako po si Roby Alampay of Signal TV, specifically of the One News channel. I'm also with the Puma podcast group. And we're here to talk about the state of journalism in the Philippines. Our guests tonight and the organizations they belong to have experienced all the problems, all the charges that we've talked about. Siguro kung kumpunihin natin lahat ng legal fees nila, we don't know how much dolomite we can buy for Manila Bay, how many PRC tests we can buy for Filipinos. Meet some of our country's bravest truth frontliners. Ging Reyes, head of the Integrated News and Current Affairs of ABS-CBN Corporation. Siya po yung nakita natin sa Kongreso. Maria Ressa, siya yung nakita natin sa kung ano-anong korte. CEO, Executive Editor of Rappler. John Nery, columnist of the Philippine Daily Inquirer, Chairman of the Board of the Asian Center for Journalism at Ateneo. And then Shiela Coronel, Ramon Magsaysay awardee lang naman po, Director of the Tony Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism and a professor at Columbia Journalism School. And sasama na rin po natin dito, kasama natin one of the veteran senior journalists of the Philippines from the Associated Press, Mr. Jim Gomez. Okay, so we'll dive straight into our conversation. Conversation to ha, we're all among friends. Feel free to take me out of this conversation and just carry on the conversation on your own. I want to start with you, Shiela, kung okay lang. Shiela, we're talking about press freedom, the state of journalism in the Philippines, reality check ang title sa series na to. Let's start with the reality check. Shiela, do you really think may pakialam yung mga Pilipino sa pag-uusapan natin? Do you really think that outside of the choir that's watching us right now and the students that are being required to watch on this Zoom link, do you really think that the rest of the Filipinos actually care?
I think they do. I started my journalism career during the Marcos era, and I was working for the Manila Bulletin, which was Marcos-controlled press. And I remember after the Aquino assassination, there was such massive anger about the suppression of press freedom. There were pickets. My friends were picketing our office outside, And when I would go to the rallies, people would shout at me, tell the truth, because they knew the truth was suppressed. There has historically been very strong support for press freedom in the Philippines. Our founding fathers, if you can call them that, were journalists. They knew the power of the written word. And up to now, there is still this expectation that journalists will stand up to power. And there is vast public support for the role of journalists as not just as chroniclers of what's happening, but as watchdogs who hold powerful individuals and institutions to account. So I have deep faith in this intrinsic and long-standing belief of Filipinos. We've seen it throughout our history, the Second World War, the Marcos era, all the periods of repression. Filipinos have hankered to not just write the truth, but to hear about the truth.
Yes, but Shiela, I want to invite everybody here in this conversation, but Shiela, you're citing people power. You're citing the 1980s. In the meantime, Maria's gotten arrested how many times? ABS-CBN was taken off the air just this past month. Where's the rally? Where is the outrage? Yes, there were people who picketed. There were people who went out. Never mind COVID. But where is the outrage? Do you really feel it?
Well, I'm not in the Philippines at the moment, but I think at least from what I've seen on social media and what I hear from my friends and the family, there is outrage, but it's not the kind of outrage that is spilling out into the streets. It is so we should distinguish. I know that the president has vast support, but we should distinguish between that and the support for what he's doing to the media. If you ask the ordinary Filipino, do they want more choices in what they're reading, hearing, watching on TV? What would the answer be? I'm sure the answer would be yes. I don't think any Filipino would say, no, I just want one version of the truth. I just want the government's version. Otherwise, Channel 4 would be the runaway TV station, right? People want a plurality of voices, and they're not getting that in this current media landscape.
Okay. I mean, Ging, I mean, everybody knows about what happened to ABS-CBN. Maria, we've all been following everything that's been going on with Rappler. I've always said it outright. I mean, it's very, very clear. The president has it in for Maria Ressa and Rappler. He has it in for the Inquirer. He's targeted journalists. But Ging and Maria specifically, tell me, did you feel it? How did you feel it? And is there a part of you that's you know, somewhat wondering then if there is support, is there outrage enough to actually believe that there's something that I should be, I don't know, marching for, fighting for, in whatever form? Ging?
You know, Robbie, I think our fate in the hands of the NTC and later on the Congress became a rallying point or a rallying cry for press freedom. And for the first time in a long time, the mass audience was able to relate to it. They had an appreciation and an understanding of why we were shut down, for instance. You can see that in their comments on social media. You can see that in their feedback that they give to us in our shows, and you know, the direct calls or text messages that they send to our programs. I think there is support for freedom and for freedom of choice when it comes to news content and even entertainment content. It's just that people are also concerned with, I think, more basic things, more to them, more essential things in their lives right now, especially with this pandemic. We saw people, you know, join the noise barrage around ABS-CBN every Friday beginning, I think around the time that the franchise hearings were being held. And before that, before the lockdown, there were really big crowds along Sergeant Esguerra Avenue in Quezon City. I guess it was a function of timing, fear of COVID, as well as, you know, people think still not that the problem of press freedom is something that maybe others would fight for, or maybe the media practitioners and the journalists are in a better position to fight for. Parang ganun yung prevailing sentiment sa nababasa namin sa ngayon. But they are concerned and there is outrage. It's just that it's not enough for a massive turnout on the streets.
But why not? I mean, like as Sheila said, we stopped the country. We stopped not just the government. We stopped all business in this country to bring back democracy. And maybe that's a function of having really, really lost it. Diba? I mean, it's one thing to, it's another thing to be surrounded by this cacophony all around us and say, well, mukha namang nandiyan pa ang GMA, mukhang nandiyan pa ang Rappler, nandiyan pa Inquirer, sa totoo naman, nakikita ko pa rin naman lahat to, and so on. So, and Maria, where is the disconnect, Maria? Where do you think is the disconnect? Because I do want to believe that there is sympathy on the one hand. At the same time, there is a real value behind it, and there's really something foundational for Filipinos. But where is that disconnect?
I think first, look, the reality is we live in an environment of violence and fear, right? That's the first. Then you add COVID on top of that, probably the one of the the world's longest lockdown, and certainly one of the most security driven, along with Bolsonaro, Brazil, and the Philippines. Right, our pandemic response was led by retired military generals largely. So people know that there are costs to standing up. And if it isn't the government, if you're not one of the 100,000 plus arrested for quarantine violations or worse, you then can get COVID-19, right? So the costs are high. The timing is perfect for shutting down ABS-CBN, right? The conditions of martial law are there without declaring martial law. And then I think the third thing is that, and we don't, I talk about this all the time. It's really the fact that our information ecosystem is turned upside down. And that is that 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. That social media, which has become a behavior modification system, is where Filipinos get their news. And that's, I'm sure we're going to talk about the surveys that are coming up, but this distorts everything because social media actually changes the way you think and the way you act. It is passive, like advertising, right? So
yeah, and that's fair, diba? I mean, all externalities factored in. Maybe I've been brainwashed. Right? I mean, that's a reality. But John, we're talking about fear. We're talking about social media really rewiring our brains to the detriment of our own interests. But you mentioned surveys, Maria. I precisely was going there. Part of the reason I asked this was also, look, approval ratings and trust ratings for media is what, 40%, 60%, diba? In the meantime, approval rating for President Duterte is 91%. I mean, is there anything there that you would qualify or outright deny that approval for this government that we do see as detrimental to press freedom is very high, and then trust for media is really, let's face it, really appalling. I mean, so John, is there may be a value there may be a sympathy, but do you think that may have something to do with kung saan tayo nabibitin?
Well, I'm the only opinion journalist in this panel, so I feel even more like an imposter. Having said that, I will inflict my opinion on this forum. The real disconnect, Robbie, is in using a framework that no longer applies. It's old generals fighting the old war. Has there been outrage? Yes, of course, there has been outrage. I was at the Friday rallies in ABS-CBN before and at the start of the pandemic. And I have to tell you, it was growing every Friday. And at a certain point when the stars came out, I mean, it was just nothing like EDSA yet. It was growing. And then the pandemic, really hit us hard the middle of March. So that was one thing. When ABS-CBN was shut down May 5 and then July 13, the franchise was rejected, there was an outpouring also of outrage on social media. There are many ways to gauge outrage. One of them would be how many people signed up to be volunteers for the People's Initiative for a franchise for ABS. And as I understand, in 24 hours, they got 10,000 plus volunteers. So, there are many things. But going back to the current question about surveys, yes, it is true that the president has 91% approval rating, but it is also true that all the surveys since he came on board show that majority of Filipinos don't want suspects to be killed. About 90%, about the same. About 75% of Filipinos say they are afraid that they or someone they know will be the next victim of an extrajudicial killing. Less than 10% of survey respondents say that they believe 100% definitely that the police do everything and kill only pag may nanlaban. All right. So it's not enough for us to just point at one number and say, oh, 91%, and that excuses everything. No, the same surveys also show that a majority of Filipinos, around 50-something, 52, 54%, know that the media is under pressure under Duterte. So it's a complicated thing. In a way, what's holding back the opposition is their dependence on surveys. I know I started by talking about using false analogies, but when we go back to the anti-Marcos struggle, we didn't contend with surveys. We just did the right thing, right? Now you have politicians saying, what's the weather like? It cannot be like that, right? So I mean, that's also part of the reason why the outrage has sort of simmered down. Aside from the pandemic, there's also a sort of political calculation that comes in that wasn't there 30 years ago.
Sige, let's look inwards. Let's talk about journalists per se. Jim Gomez, and I'll throw everybody who's been covering and been journalists for decades. Are we scared? I mean, Jim, not just for this panel, but for journalists in general, especially the young people, even veterans for that matter. How would you answer that? Are Filipinos scared at this point?
Yung earlier question mo, Robbie, if you look around, and it's our job to really write down what's happening every time in this country. You see what's happening to Maria, like Station of the Cross, tragic closure of ABS-CBN, and what you see, the persona of this president. So for a foreigner, it's easy to outsiders in this country. It's easy to get lost in the Philippine story. The dynamics are so complicated, and it's not easy to understand this authoritarian populism that hit us. No? So we've seen a preview of what happened in Davao, 1,000 dead. And still, he got more than 16 million votes in 2016. No? So I think there's a window here for our universities, political scientists to look into. So we'll understand the mindset, the public's perception of their leaders, how they make their choices. And we're in 2 years, we're going to another national election. So. It's really crucial for us to understand what is happening. I think there's no one answer to this. We journalists will be better armed if we understand these political dynamics.
Okay. Anybody else? Are we scared? Do you? I mean, we talk about chilling effect. Let's spell it out. Parang nakakatakot, di ba? But are we scared? I mean, are your reporters scared? Are the people staying out of the journalism program? If they are in the journalism program, why would they want to be in the journalism program? But I mean, that's a basic question. Are we in fact scared? I always say this when I'm speaking, as Jim pointed out, when I'm speaking with foreigners. I always tell them, when you come to the Philippines and you see the cacophony of coverage, and you look at social media and how ribald and how aggressive netizens can be, it's really very hard to make that argument that people are afraid in the Philippines. And going to your point, Sheila, they are quite brave. So therefore, how do you answer that question? That are people in fact getting cowed?
I'll jump in really quickly here. It's meant to scare you. It's meant to intimidate you. But frankly, the impact on me is I'm angry. I mean, I've never had, by next year, I'll have been a journalist for 35 years. We all came of age at about the same time, diba? And I've covered in many countries around the world. This time period is one of a kind, and the Duterte administration is one of a kind. I certainly hope, like the pandemic, it's once every 100 years. But, I guess where it comes to me is anger is a reaction to to show you how difficult it is to do our jobs. These are the consequences of doing our jobs. I mean, literally, I have 8 criminal cases, and those charges cumulatively are almost 100 years, even though there's that clause that says, oh, I could be compressed to 40 some odd years. A journalist shouldn't have to deal with things like that, right? So anyway, I'll shut up because I want to hear also, right?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think it's the government that's afraid. I mean, you have a government that's very strong, that has the military and the police under its command, and it's clamping down on these young reporters at Rappler. I mean, that is such an asymmetrical battle. It's threatening the publishers of newspapers. It's closed down the largest TV network. Those are actions of fear, not strength. Why are they afraid? Because they are afraid that the truth will come out. They are afraid that, you know, the watchdog tradition in the Philippine media would assert itself. They are afraid that all the corruption and abuses that are happening in this regime are going to be exposed. It's the government that's afraid. So I think to say that citizens are afraid, some of them are for sure, but I think the government is even more fearful. This government is afraid it will be held to account when there's a new government that is in power that is not friendly to them.
Can I ask you a question, Sheila? I mean, as former director, as a founder of PCIJ, as a teacher of journalism, you mentioned being taken to account, because this is a question I wanted to ask later on. But when you imagine a post-Duterte administration, and like I said, look, we've always been in crisis. We faced ERAP, we had Marcos, GMA, everybody brought something to the table in terms of reminding us that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Okay, all of that. Diba? But Duterte, as people say, ibang klase. But speaking of holding them to account and the current climate, how do you imagine the climate in the post-Duterte, from day one of post-Duterte? What do you see happening? Is there suddenly going to be a dam burst of coverage of certain areas? What kinds of projects do you want to see? Not out of spite or but genuinely as a news person thinking, these are the things that are inevitably going to be covered.
I think a lot depends on who's going to take over after Duterte and what kinds of policies that new president is going to implement. But we've really had, you know, looking at the recent past, you've had the Aquino government holding, you know, Chief Justice Corona and the ombudsman who was appointed by President Arroyo. You know, you had that, and then you had Duterte doing the same thing to Laila de Lima. So I see that there's going to be a similar pattern if there's a different government that's going to be in power. But I think without the restraints, I think in some cases that the dam will burst, because there are people not just in the media, but also in the opposition, and people who've been, you know, who've been targeted, as well as genuine citizens who want to hold. I still have faith that some of our institutions are going to work, that we can still assert the independence of the accountability institutions such as the courts, the Office of the Ombudsman, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's also the international piece to think about. There's the International Criminal Court. There are sanctions currently on police officers, and I think as people feel freer to talk, there will be more cases filed. I mean, thousands of victims were killed in the drug war. Yeah. So, but let me just say, it's not just for the drug war victims. It's not just accountability. There has to be reconciliation within those communities, because those communities have been divided by this peace, and there has to be a real effort to reconcile, you know.
And not just healing and reconciliation and justice. The reality is, as mentioned kanina, somebody touched on it, we do have to make that connection on what press freedom and independent media brings literally to the table of Filipinos, diba? Make it clear that, you know, there is a utilitarian and a real value to you having your democracy and press freedom. Yes, pwedeng kainin ng demokrasya, but that's very hard to communicate. But natawa lang ako, Sheila, because you said you put your faith in the institutions. And we have institutions that certainly need mending, and we put our faith there as well. But very often the politics and the realities of government here in the Philippines, it always goes back to personalities. It always goes back to the sophistication and savviness and shallowness or depth of our leaders. Kanina nag-uusap kami ni Ging, and I wanted to get your reaction, di ba, Ging? Because last week, Congressman Eric Yap, in a conversation with Christian Esguerra, Marshall McLuhan Fellow for 2020, was interviewing Eric Yap. And Eric Yap said, with a very straight face, and I would like to allow, in all sincerity, said, balang araw magpapasalamat ang ABS-CBN sa ginawa namin. No? And balang araw, ABS-CBN will become better and probably even better than CNN. And then they will understand why we needed to do what we needed to do. My question to Ging and my question to you, John, and to all of you.
That's his sense
The
of
people behind our institutions. Do you think they understand what they're talking about? Like, do you think? I mean, I ask this in all sincerity. Do you think that they really understand press freedom when they say, for example, I believe in press freedom, pero galingan niyo muna, or I believe in press freedom, pero be responsible naman, and then I will grant you this, or not just press freedom, human rights. I believe in human rights, pero human rights din ang hindi ma-rape ang anak ko sa ano, kaya therefore, okay ang ano. Do you think naiintindihan nila yung sinasabi nila?
Rob, if I may, and I lead to Ging, no? I think what Eric Yap said was out of a sense of guilt. I mean, that is the way they're justifying what they did. But I wanted to speak to something that you raised earlier when you characterized our history as a series of crises. Yes, that is true. But I think it is a fundamental mistake to consider this administration as just another administration. Maria was talking about maybe it happens only every 100 years. I think it happens every 30 years. Now we are actually facing the prospects of an authoritarian regime. So Erap was a terrible president, convicted of plunder, ousted from office, but he didn't have a dictatorship in mind. Unlike Duterte, who is not shy about his intentions, or Marcos. So I think it is incumbent on us as journalists not to normalize what they're doing. We cannot just say, well, it's always like this. It isn't. Maybe it's like every 30 years we have the locusts. But anyway, to go back to Ging, I really think I agree with her with what she said earlier, that in fact, I think that years from now, the followers of Duterte will regret what they did to ABS. I think that was the moment when press freedom became a bread and butter issue.
I think that's
what went dark.
No, but I think that's what I think we all know what we're saying. But I want to bring it back to my question because I mean it. I want to be charitable to Congressman Yap. Not to date myself, but I want to think that this is a young congressman, certainly younger than me. It takes a lot of chutzpah, but also I would think naivete, but also I would grant innocence, maybe even sincerity when he says that, because really it takes a lot to say something like that to an ABS-CBN anchor, diba? But yung tanong ko sa'yo, Ging, parang, and to you, Jim, because as you said, the institutions always redound at the end of the day to, sino bang nakaupo dyan? And I have a real nagging feeling that people actually, we inherited the press freedom, we inherited the democracy and the human rights, but we never really internalized it. We never really understood what it meant. And those are the people who were behind that vote for ABS-CBN. What do you think, Jim?
Well, believe me, I felt that I was in that same quandary while I was in Congress a few months back, because I was explaining how we did our jobs, and yet the lawmakers who were there at that time seemed to have been oblivious to the workings, the inner workings of journalists. And to say that, yes, we understand press freedom and we support press freedom, but be responsible. In most cases, it's just code for saying, yes, I like press freedom as long as you don't report unfavorably about me. Most of the time, it is the case with people in power. ABS-CBN, Inquirer, Rappler, and all the other news outlets have offended one way or another many of those who are in power now and before. And yet this time, somehow, it's different. Ordinary politicians would let an unfavorable coverage or even a tough interview slide after a while, right? But these days, that doesn't happen anymore. We get recurring, statements, attacks, calling us out for alleged bias or unfairness, or accusing us, our journalists, of being on the take just because questions that were asked of them in some interviews were tough or, weren't really gentle enough, or some sort of, allegation that they were not allowed to give their side, etc., etc. So some of these people behind our powerful institutions do understand what press freedom is. And yet they choose to demonize media for reasons that are self-serving, obviously. But then, yes, it's also true, Roby, that there are younger, impressionable young men and women who might believe what they see or what they hear from more sinister minds about how media should be discredited.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I ask also. It's not just about the people in the institutions, not just our leaders, not just our legislators, but the people watching. Because if somebody says, diba, I'll give you your press freedom, galingan nyo lang. There are young people who will say, well, that sounds reasonable. I don't see anything objectionable there. But Jim, I want to ask you, you've seen a lot. I mean, we've been talking about a lot of things. You've seen a lot. May bago pa dito sa pinag-uusapan natin? I mean, in these particular times, and what is different? And I want to ask Shiela also, what is different about these days? Let's say compare it to ERAP.
No, but obviously, but by no means that this is new. No, it's something new. We've seen this. I covered the twilight years of Ferdinand Marcos in the Inquirer. So then this has happened, and you were talking of reality checks. I think we have had so much reality checks, bloody, deadly reality checks. I think we have one too many monuments and shrines, for massacres and these bad events. No? So, and I want to go back briefly to your question about the surveys. As a journalist, and we've been monitoring this very religiously, I was really thinking that it was really unbelievable for somebody so far out of the box to be like in the 60s, 70s%. I was thinking there should be an element of intimidation in those surveys. But, because how they're done. No? They knock on the door, they ask your name. What would you answer when you are asked if you're fine with the president, right? So, but I was watching for the next chance of a secret way of pulsing the people, no? And that was the midterm elections, and we all know the results. The opposition was completely wiped out in the senatorial race. That hasn't happened in a long time in the Philippines. Not one opposition candidate. But I also agree with Shiela that there's really an element of fear on the side of the government, the personalities, and you can almost feel the legal preparations, the prepping up, the withdrawal from the ICC, and I was able to, like Sheila and many of us here were, I was able to cover the tail end and the overthrow in '86 and what happened after. It was a busy, busy time, moment of reckoning, and yeah, I think we may see that happening again after 2022. Whoever wins, whether his side or the opposition side or anybody, as he's one of a class.
Okay. Sheila, let's bring it back. Manila Times, during the time of ERA, putting the squeeze on the owners, putting the squeeze on advertisers, and so on. Very overt, and everybody saw it coming a mile away. It was very, very overt. What's different now?
What's different is that there is a systematic campaign to create disinformation and propaganda in favor of the government, mainly using social media, but also if you listen to radio and that filtering out to the mainstream. And let me just say, this is not unusual. The Philippines is by no means the only country where this is happening. This is a global trend. The assault on truth and on democracy is a global thing. And certainly Duterte benefits from that global populist moment in terms of, he's able, there's not much repercussion internationally, but he's also using tactics that have been used elsewhere in Russia, in China, and in other countries. So that is what's new. It's the flood. It used to be that the tactic was to curtail information that was disadvantageous to the government or to the powers that be. In the current landscape, the tactic is to flood media, including social media, mainstream media, with disinformation. So it's no longer constricting, but flooding. So that is the main difference. Let me just address Congressman Yap. I think this comes from a very macho kind of thinking. You have to be disciplined. It's also of a piece with Duterte's thinking. You're bad, you have to be disciplined, we have to spank you. It's this very patriarchal way in which our leaders think, that you discipline people by using the iron hand. It's not a democratic way of thinking, but it's very inherent in a sort of macho Filipino political culture, and so that's how I see it. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Maria.
The meaning of that is that he is young, right? And what we see there is actually somebody who shows ignorance and arrogance. I mean, it's a bit shocking. And what happened to ABS-CBN is gaslighting at any level, right? Make them afraid of the past wrongs that they may or may not have done. That wasn't the point. So again, it's misdirection. I mean, it's so interesting. Everything comes down to power and money. And that's what we've seen play out. What in the environment Sheila laid out, which is an environment of lies. I mean, Russian military, the phrase they use is the fire hose of falsehoods, right? And that's a military tactic. It's part of their military doctrine. When it's seeded on social media, when a leader lies so many times, the journalists are running around, running after, trying to fact check every lie. This happens in the US, right? I think this is, in the sense of, the fact check happens, but if the lie happens so frequently, the fact checks don't matter, and it changes the fire hose of lies, changes your reality. It makes the people more docile because you have no idea what really is truth, right?
And that's what happened with the franchise hearings, Maria.
Exactly.
We presented evidence, and yet what prevailed was Congress's version of fact, right? The case of ABS-CBN has seen all the whole gamut of disinformation, gaslighting, demonization, etc. So, and here we are. That's the biggest difference, Robbie. We have social media now. We have this very potent tool for spreading disinformation that was not in existence during the time of Marcos or era por Gloria Arroyo.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of gaslighting, as you said, one of the things that they did with ABS-CBN was to say, after asking about BIR obligations, SEC, NTC, all the regulators said, "Hindi, walang kasalanan yan." At the end of the day, hindi, this is about oligarchies. We're breaking up oligarchies. And that was the gaslighting, the ultimate gaslighting there. But I do want to bring up, therefore, on the point of oligarchy, something that is not new. Something is very old. Something that I've always felt has always been the Achilles heel of media in the Philippines. And that's ownership, right? Ownership has always been a vulnerability for all of us. You have the Prietos with the Inquirer. You have the Lopezes of ABS-CBN. I come from TV5 and Signal, MVP Group. A lot of regulated industries there. Maria, never mind Omidyar, never mind, but the people in your board who invested and so on, they're all businessmen. They're all thinking of their investments. And this is an old trick. How do we address this Achilles heel? I mean, it's always going to be exposed. On the other hand, when you go to the other end of the spectrum where you have very small independent media trying to make it on their own, no ownership issues outside of their small media. Yeah, but then they don't have the audience. But it's in the big players that I want to ask. How do we not fix? It's just a reality, diba? But how do we take that reality given that time and again with every administration, not just this administration, ownership has always been the target and the Achilles heel
Sorry, Robbie, I have to correct you on that. I mean, in the sense that in Rappler, the journalists, we control it. I mean, in the sense that we own the most shares as a whole. And then the other part of it is, I think that ownership isn't always the Achilles heel. I mean, it can be an excuse. It can be an excuse for the propaganda. Business can, at least in terms of the tactics of the attack on the media right now, the attack is led by the law and by the BIR, right? If you look at the way we are all being attacked, and that is not about one family or even ownership. It really is a different time. I am not an oligarch, and yet social media says I am, right? I mean, that's why the reason I challenge that is because the ownership of Rappler, it's the journalists who control it, and yet we're under attack as well. I think this is about a clamp down on media. This is what it is. It is, there isn't really anything, like there's nothing that any journalist here can do any better or any worse. It will still be. Sorry, I'll shut up.
No, I mean, all points well taken. But my point is just the strategy. It's not to say that this is the reality. It's just to say that they did use ownership. They did throw it in there. They did use it as an excuse, if that's how you want to look at it. But that is an opening that they will exploit. If there's no opening, they will invent the opening. I guess that's the point, right? Yeah. But Ging, I mean, the context here is, for example, with the Lopez. Everybody said, okay lang yan kasi pagka wala na yung airtime and nasa digital na and hindi na regulated yung franchise nyo, okay yan, pwede nang magsalita ang mga taga ABS-CBN. But the message was very clear before they put down the gavel. They said, di pa tapos kasi yung Lopez's oligarchy ang pag-uusapan natin dito, di ba? And it's really about the owner. So, I mean, what do you think? There will always be that vulnerability, especially almost by definition among the biggest players and the most influential players in Philippine media.
Yes, the thing is, Robbie, in this country, media ownership, I mean, running a media company is an expensive proposition. Look, you know the numbers by now. ABS-CBN used to make 50 million a day, or we were losing 30 million a day in the time of COVID when we were shut down, right? Magastos ang pagpapatakbo ng isang media company, and I don't know who had dared operate and run a media company in this country that succeeded. It's always been those who are part of the elite. And I don't know when or if there will be ever a time when media ownership in the Philippines would really change, when control would really go to, say, a cooperative of journalists or a trust, which is the idea, a la Guardian. That cannot happen here.
I wanted to see some of that, Sheila. I want to ask, sabi nga ni Ging, it may be a pipe dream to ask when that will happen. But I want to ask you, Sheila, because you have this worldview, literally, from Columbia University, J School. You're involved in media development in a lot of places. How about the where? Is there a where? Is there a place? Is there a model out there that allowed media to address this question of not just ownership, but stability and independence for its mainstream media?
Well, there are certainly many models. One is what the public broadcasting or public media model, where you have taxpayer-supported media, like in the UK or in the Scandinavian countries, Canada, New Zealand, where you have, or even here in the US, public media speaking to a broader audience and ensuring as much inclusion and representation and not beholden to any political power. We don't have that in the Philippines. What we have is a government propaganda channel and a government propaganda machine. So that's one model. Another model is independent nonprofit media. You know, The Guardian is one. Le Monde is run by a cooperative. The AP is a cooperative. The other model, which in theory should work, which is, you know, basically the US model, that you have a plurality of media owners representing a plurality of views that are privately owned, therefore independent from government funding. That's the theory of the US media, but we see the failings now as the revenue models are collapsing. And so what we're seeing here is actually families or rich billionaires buying media like Bezos, the Washington Post, in Utah, the Huntsman family. So we're seeing a reversal back to family-owned media. But I think the concept of media as a public trust is what is paramount. It's enshrined in constitutions. This is why media has power. That's why there is press freedom. It's because you're supposed to be serving the public, right? You have constitutionally guaranteed freedoms, not to advance your own interests, but to advance the public interest. It's more in theory than in practice. But certainly there are models around the world. What will prevail in the Philippines? I think, you know, to Jing's point, it's okay to have big media, but I think we should also have small media. So there's small media has always been a corrective. Community media, PCIJ, all of that, Rappler, have been a corrective to big media.
Okay, let me use this to dovetail into a general question of, what do we want to do? Ang gagawin natin? And specifically to all of you, here's a question from, is he senator now? Is he, or let's say citizen Sunny Trillanes. A question from, he's watching. We'd like to thank everyone for watching. You're on Daang Docu, and thank you for joining us in this wonderful festival. But here's a question from Mr. Trillanes. In a hypothetical scenario, and I have to say this is a very hypothetical scenario, if the opposition wins in 2022, what public policies should be adopted to address the problems besetting Philippine media and journalism today? I mean, John, what would you like to see by way of legislation?
Whether or not the opposition wins, I think it is important for us to realize that it is a mistake to put government power, to put the power to issue licenses to TV networks in the hands of government. So whether the opposition wins or not, that's one of the things that we should be advocating for. We need to look for a different way of...
Sorry, John, before, para lang hindi, because I want to get as many suggestions as possible before we dive into the details. Ikaw, Ging, what would you like to see? I mean, John already said, let's take that power out of Congress. Let's take it out. Okay, Dan, what else would you like to see?
Um, well, John took the words right out of my mouth. There is really a big question mark in the current practice, in the current law that gives that power to lawmakers, to politicians, who are the ones we cover, who are the subjects of critical coverage at times. So you can see the conflict there. Aside from that, I think, yes, there should be an encouragement of smaller media companies in this country, maybe maybe more protection for those journalists out there in the provinces who are vulnerable to violence.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Jim, wait, Jim, before maybe this will prompt you also. And let me throw this in. This is from Weng Paraan, former chairperson of NUJP. Hi, Weng. Thank you. But she raises a very important point. Of course, that, all of us are Manila-centric. We all come from the city, every major organization here. She points out, let's not forget, this is our first time with a mayor. But the community journalists, the provincial journalists deal with real mayors every day as well. Napi-PI silang lahat araw-araw. They have to, and it's a totally different dynamic when you're in your hometown, in the same neighborhood as the police and so on. So just throwing that in, among other things that you would like to see by way of policy, how do we raise not only the protection, but also the viability of community voices as well? Jim, what would you like to suggest?
Yeah, no, I just want to briefly go back to the issue of ownership of in the local media industry. I think that's really a very weak spot of the industry. We've seen how Marcos, exploited that weakness of his political nemesis. So at that time, we were covering, everyone knows how people resorted to, looking for foreign news and, copying this news reports about the shenanigans of the Marcos administration. And, it happened again, like in the case of ABS-CBN. But I think that there are some things that have changed. The media in this country used to be a contained space. Literally, it's owned by the big networks. But now you have social media, you have Facebook. They close ABS-CBN. Where is ABS-CBN now? It did not give up, still reporting online. What is the platform of Rappler? It's social media. So, but I think there have to be improvements in the way that medium is used. So, yeah, there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of there are more options now than what has happened before under Marcos.
Yeah. Maria, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I wanted to put very quickly on the table other reforms that we can look for, that we can advocate would be, to continue advocating for decriminalization of libel, which is a potent weapon in the hands of the unscrupulous, and also to there is a law that that mandates the media and information literacy module, I think for grade 11. But what has happened is that it's really more of like, it's not about the news cycle, it's not about the news process at all. So if that can be revisited and given earlier, not in grade 11 but even earlier, I think that's something that's worth pursuing.
Yeah.
I'll add,
Sheila,
yeah, Robbie, I'll add the kind of the pillars, right? I think, and this is something that as legislators and the judiciary should be looking at, is think about what holds up our democracy. And I think this time is really existential. So how do we strengthen all of that? Journalism is only one. I think the first pillar is technology. I mean, my lordy, I keep looking for technology legislation that addresses the fundamental problem. And this is actually connected to social media, right? When the platforms that deliver news actually are prioritize lies laced with anger and hate. That spreads faster and further than facts, the news, right? So you can actually say that the very platforms that are not from the Philippines, these platforms, delivery platforms of news, of information, are biased against facts. I mean, then the second thing is journalism. Who speaks truth to power? Who is trained? Who has standards and ethics? You've got to either strengthen, that means allow the business model to survive. Advertising is crumbling. This is part of the reason, there's an initiative that we're part of. It's an attempt to try to raise $1 billion a year to try to fund independent media globally, right? Nothing like that in the Philippines. In fact, here it's the other way: choke them, kill them, squeeze them. That's journalism. You need facts, right? So first is the delivery of facts is flawed. Where is the legislation to try to protect the public in that, the users, the public sphere? The second is the journalists. You have to not just protect physically, but the business model is dead. So we don't have a public And then finally, the third one, which is critical, is civil society. The NGOs who are there, if they don't have facts, how can they act in the real world? Here's your other part. If you don't have facts, how can you have integrity of markets or integrity of elections? That's the false, all the lies that come are actually a strategy and a tactic. So civil society, how do you strengthen that in a time of pandemic? Who gets funding, right? There's so many things to think about. It's a great question. I just hope that we get there from here, right? How do we get there from here?
According to Mr. Trillanes, the opposition needs to win.
They need to be more organized.
Yeah.
Sheila, what would you say? Is there a simple, again, looking at models all over the world, has there been a simple turnkey by way of reform that actually led to, wow, simple thing, it causes really fundamental change?
I don't think there's a silver bullet because it's such a complex issue. But certainly one thing that can be done is repeal the cyber libel law. That's immediate. That can be done because that's really a sword hanging over the heads of journalists. But other things that can be done, especially for community media, and I hear when, because community media is really important. And in fact, local communities, especially the farther you are from Manila, the less well-served you are in terms of media. I think there should be some effort, I don't know, maybe rural banks or PNB or DBP. All they've done in these banks have done in the past was to provide BS loans to cronies of government. Why can't there be a loan facility that is, very low interest, that will be open to small entrepreneurs, and there can be a cap on what kind of, and maybe there should be prioritized media cooperatives that can then get soft loans to be able to set up media businesses. And there should be some, accompanying training and other things for them. There can be like a rescue fund, like we rescue industries that are under threat. And certainly the media is a threatened industry, but the rescue, not the big players, but the small ones and the new ones, because, why should you rescue, dying news organizations? I think we need to provide an environment where we can seed new news organizations. So money is one, but certainly the freedom to operate is another. Third, support in terms of training, use of technology, etc. But let's also not forget the audience, because the audience has to see the full play of the internet, not just Facebook. And this is why I think Wi-Fi connectivity, Roby, is important. Wi-Fi to Mr. Pangilinan, what cheap Wi-Fi available, and maybe there should be like public hotspots or public libraries, because that's what we need, are places where people can congregate and consume media that's not just Facebook, because Facebook is free, or maybe subsidize, things like the Ang Docu. That the subsidies for independent documentaries have been great. Maybe there should be similar subsidies for independent media or education projects.
Yeah, okay, pwede yan. In lieu of a public broadcasting system, some sort of a public journalism fund.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, John, I wanted to talk about something. I mean, this is pretty big reform. It's multi-generational. You talked about the audience, as Sheila pointed out. We can't let this generation and the next just keep growing up in this environment where they can't tell the fact from fiction. I've always said that, one virtue of a generation that doesn't know what to believe should be that they shouldn't believe anything. Right? I mean, I think we were all brought up in a generation where if it's in black and white, but that's the term, diba? It's in black and white, therefore it must be true. Diba? I think this next generation should be taught from the start that no, start from a premise na you will not believe anything, right? Until you know what to look for. Maybe that will bring brass. But anyway, this is about you. I want to ask you, John, and all of you, how do we make a resilient population, an information, not just literate population, but an information resilient population?
First, I think we need to make a distinction between skepticism, which we should encourage, and cynicism, which we should discourage. So this whole notion that we cannot believe anything, that doesn't really work in real life. There are certain things that you need to take on faith, that you need to take based on how you assess a person's credibility. But what we need to do is to develop this habit of skepticism, especially when it comes to life or death issues, very important matters. You need to weigh it. And I think that it's important. Now we are beginning to speak in terms of fostering critical thinking. That's fine, right? We talk about cognitive biases and so on. But I think it's also important, and I think Maria will have something to say about this, that because social media is actually based on largely on an appeal to the non-rational part, to emotion, we must have some sort of, for lack of a better term, critical feeling type of skills building, right? So I hosted a forum a few weeks ago on martial law, and there was someone from the Ilocos region who asked, aside from the murder and the greediness of Marcos, what else can you say about him? In other words, looking for the positive things. And then in the discussion, she said, and out of, I think, genuine sincerity, saying, well, yeah, we hear that, but, right? And if I had been present in that particular forum, I would have come in and said, we should be skeptical about our buts. Okay, why do we say, why can't we just accept that there are some people who, on balance, have done more bad than good? And part of the reason why we can't accept that is because we have some perhaps unexamined assumptions. So yung idea na critical thinking matched with, for lack of a better term, critical feeling might be a way of getting at the problem.
Ging, how do we address well, it is a problem, not necessarily their fault, but how do we address that problem on the side of the audience? They're spoiled for Facebook, and they're spoiled for content fed to them by algorithms, and therefore, by definition, by their own biases and the interests of their friends. They create their own bubbles, and there is that, as I said, that syndrome that they don't know how to consume news. They don't have that critical thinking. What can we do?
Robbie, it's a failure both of the education system and the media itself. I am quite passionate about this idea because, when we weren't looking, the education curriculum just drastically changed. Nawala ang history, for instance. And suddenly we were shocked that there was hardly any mention of martial law in history books for elementary and high school students, or that the story or the portion about the EDSA revolution was just a little more than a page, or even less in some cases. We weren't looking. We didn't know that that was changed, or we probably were busy with other news events, right? And then the other thing is media itself. Media fed our audience too much entertainment. We're guilty of that, and this may not be a popular observation to some of my colleagues, but I do believe our audience is over entertained and underinformed, and that is the thing that we need to change.
Okay, Jim, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, no. Actually, I wanted to throw a question to Sheila, no? If I may, Robbie.
Yeah, of course.
So, yeah, Sheila is in a very good vantage. No? So I wanted to ask you, Sheila, what do you think, and how would you compare the pushback between the Philippine media and the U.S. media on leaders that are, the different dynamics, but they have a lot of similarities. What are the weaknesses and the pitfalls that you see? Where can improvements be made?
Well, the problem of disinformation, as I said, is global, and certainly here, especially now during the U.S. elections, there's massive disinformation, and you have, big, really well-resourced media organizations trying to fight back by calling out lies. They said President Trump said a lie, or putting a lot of things in context. That's what, the Washington Post, that's what the New York Times does, that's what some of the big networks do. They outrightly, which I don't see in the Philippine press, when Duterte says something that's a lie, nobody's putting that in context. So there all of this, trying to put much more context and interpretation in the news rather than the flat news reporting. There was a recent study by some Harvard, people like Yochai Benkler, where they looked at disinformation regarding these elections, and they actually said, one last bulwark against disinformation in the U.S. is the media, especially, and you will like this, Jim, especially the AP, which is, because media is polarized all over the U.S., but the AP feeds by giving fact-based information to local newspapers and local radio stations in local communities. They are able to stanch the flow of this information up to a point. But the media landscape is totally, it's wild. It's anarchic. And sure, we can do education, but that would be a long time. And I agree with Maria that at some point regulation is necessary. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they all have to take an active part, and we have to re-examine the algorithmic business model upon which these businesses are based. I mean, some of that is going to happen probably because there's now antitrust legislation against Google, maybe Facebook will be next, but some of that is happening, and the platforms are now doing minor tweaking because they know they're going to be regulated. In the Philippines, we don't have the power to regulate Facebook, right? Or Twitter. Facebook or Twitter will intervene if it's a US election, but they will not intervene probably if it's a Philippine election, because it's too complicated for them. They don't have the knowledge, and frankly, we don't have the consumer power or whatever. So we have to do this on our own, and it has to be all of us, not just journalists, but I think culture, popular culture plays a huge part in this. Churches, schools, all of us as citizens have a role. Yeah.
Let me throw in a question from Dindoman Hit of Strat-Based Group. I think you know him, Albert Del Rosario Institute. He says, what are your proposals for partnerships between media, the public sector, the business sector, and citizens towards creating a more participative, democratic environment? For that matter, this is the Ang Docu. This is the filmmakers, the artists, the creatives taking part in this. Are we working enough with the other content developers, with the other creatives, with artists, with filmmakers, and so on?
Rob, if I may, I'll take the first crack at this. One of the things that the private sector can do and civil society can do in partnership with the media community is to precisely fund those small shops, the community newspapers or news organizations that we've been talking about. So for instance, Mindan News has been doing terrific work over the last couple of decades. But its finances, as far as I can understand them, are, you know, I guess more hit or miss. But it would be wonderful if like a public journalism fund, quote unquote, can be set up to fund their journalism, or, you know, going to the Northern Dispatch, or Central Luzon CLTV with Sonia Soto. I mean, there are specific examples of this, and I think that's one way that the private sector and the civil society can help our fellow journalists.
Can I add and just tie John and Sheila together? So I think we still kind of think that news organizations are powerful. We keep forgetting that that power, which came from gatekeeping, has been stripped from us and is now with technology.
That's a good
And
point.
so that's why I say we fight impunity on two fronts right now. You know, we're trying to demand accountability of the government, as we are trying to demand accountability of Facebook, of the platforms that give our things. So I would say just two things. We need to tell our public that when you go on social media, that you are being manipulated. And it's not pro Duterte or anti Duterte, it is the platform itself that manipulates you. It's insidious. Everything you put in, if you guys haven't seen Social Dilemma, watch. You know, everything you put in creates a model of who you are that is more accurate than anything you can say. And then all of that, your behavior is sold. Your most vulnerable moment to a message can be sold to a company or a government. And that artificial intelligence that pulls that together keeps that loop going, right? So we are insidiously manipulated. The strongest force in the Philippines is the pro Duterte state sponsored propaganda. And that affects the way we see reality. So, how do you fight that? How does civil society fight that? You help fund the truth tellers and their journalists, their documentary filmmakers. You help us survive. You have the courage to stand up and call a lie, and put context. We have to collaborate. Sorry, those. So really easy things, right?
Yeah, Sheila, I know, Sheila, PCIJ went into this, you know, what are the other forms of storytelling? How do we collaborate with musicians, with rappers? How do we collaborate with even children's book illustrators? I remember your project on Kian de los Santos, rendered as a children's book. What other collaborations do you think we should be exploring?
I think there's a lot of collaborations we can do, particularly with, you talk about private business. You know, a lot of the private schools now are owned by business houses. And certainly we could work with them on doing educational products. And I think there's a lot of creativity out there. It's just that we haven't had opportunity. Maybe we should have a sort of meetups and matchups where we can brainstorm and work on things together, because I think the artists are very eager to work with journalists, and the journalists have sort of been very constrained by the format of journalism and news, that maybe we can have this, you know, interesting collaborations if we work together. And we should just think of news and journalism as information, as a continuum, rather than this is what journalists do, and this is what artists do, and this is what communities do. A lot of, for example, here, some investigative reporting centers have mounted theater plays based on their reporting. I mean, documentaries are having a heyday. So thank you, Cara, for putting the Ang Docu together. But certainly, the documentary form is very effective form in terms of explaining complex issues that the news format, because of the length, because of, you know, various constraints, is not able to do. Yes, we can do it, but we have to find a point where we can meet and work together, and some money to make those collaborations possible.
Ging, what's happening to the people, the 11,000 who lost their jobs? And where are they? Where do they take their energy, if they still have the energy? I mean, we can understand if, you know, they need a break. I mean, it's really something else. But I know there are initiatives as well. I know that there is a spark in journalists that's very hard to kill. what's happening to give us some ideas on where people are channeling their energies now?
Well, as you know, yeah, we've had several waves of layoffs already. About half of the 11,000 have lost their jobs, Robbie. Some of them, you know where they went. Some of them are with TV5 now. And yet there are some who couldn't find a job in journalism or in the news organizations that are still around. So I think it's also very evident now that a lot of our former colleagues are putting up their, small businesses. The pandemic has certainly helped create bakers and chefs and cooks and entrepreneurs among us. And so that's where they are. However, the journalists that we've had to let go are still mostly, taking a break for now, for a few months maybe, and are intent on finding work in the same field. I think they just, well, it was a very traumatic experience for all of us. And so many just needed some time to, get their bearings together and recover. But yes, many would still want to do journalism. There are some who went to, a few who went to the government station or public relations, in fact. So it is what it is. They need to feed their families and make a living.
Yeah. Jim, you have a question for Ging.
Yeah, Jing, since we're on ABS-CBN, I wanted to ask you, in the office where I sit, where I work, in our newsroom, there's a wall that's dedicated to flat TVs. We monitor all the networks with all the radio stations blaring. But I would like to say that ABS-CBN has been one of the most useful in my work. So now it's gone. I think with the closure of ABS-CBN, it's one of the most massive information blackouts or outages that I've seen in my life as a journalist. So what I want to ask is, it hasn't been quantified, but how much of an information blackout or information vacuum has been created by the closure of ABS-CBN? I know that I've talked with some of your people that, you use satellites that can reach places, even beyond the line of sight, beyond mountains. And you're the only one who can do that. I asked this because of two concerns: impunity, darkness, lack of information and media, posters, impunity. And we're going to 2022. There's a lot of information blackout, and the only narrative that people will hear in a lot of places would be the government narrative. So how massive is this blackout?
You could say that 60 million or 69 million Filipino viewers every month no longer see ABS-CBN on their free-to-air channels. That's how massive that's how bad our reach has been diminished badly. In many parts of the country, there are people who complain whenever there are typhoons, that they never really get updated information or storm warnings even. Our own reporters are witnesses to this in Aurora or in parts of Quezon, parts of Panay Island, down to places like Agusan. ABS-CBN is being missed by ordinary folks who can't afford data, who can't afford to watch our news programs on Facebook or YouTube. We now have a block time arrangement with Channel 11 with the Zoe TV. But as you know, there is no news program in that arrangement. We still operate our news channels, ANC and Teleradio, but we've had to, compress our programming. We used to be 24/7, and now we sign off at 10 p.m. Part of our cost cutting, because we can't be can't operate the same way we used to. And of course, our current affairs has been shut down totally. Only TV Patrol is airing on prime time, and that's not even really airing because it's streaming only and is on cable. So that's how massive the TV Patrol used to make up to 15 million pesos a day. Now we only make maybe 1 million on a good day in advertising revenues.
Okay. We'll get
That's how
back to-
massive the impact of the shutdown is to our journalists and to us, to our producers. We only were able to do a couple of documentaries this year. I had to stop the team from working on any other documentary, in fact. So there is that.
We'll get into all of this some more. We're actually running overtime at this point, but we'll stay on for another 15 minutes. We'll see how we feel. But in the meantime, Maria does have to go. So Maria, I'll let you have one final message. But I, if you don't mind, I want to prompt you because I remember having breakfast with Sheila. Sabi ni Sheila, I was meeting with young reporters from various groups, just from many organizations. And they had this sense na, what should we do? What do you think we should be doing? They were looking to journalists of our generation, asking us, what did you do before? And what do you think we can be doing now? What do you think, Maria, we should be doing now? I mean, something that we can, let's make this a productive Zoom, di ba? What can we do?
So many things. So the first, I guess, is just understand this is it. If we don't do our jobs, if we don't do more, democracy as we know it will die. This is where we're headed, right? Number two, what Ging said, what happened to ABS-CBN, she only quantified the impact right now, but we're just starting to look at all the data. There is a cultural, like it's almost like a mushroom cloud afterwards, because the first part that she talked about is just the creation of the information and content that reaches people, but then afterwards all of the other, like the star magic ball not happening, right? What does that do? That has an impact on advertising, that has an impact on the economy. So those are other things are there. So existential for democracy, for journalists. And then I think the last part is, I take a page out of the Real Facebook Oversight Board. It's a group of 25 people who came together. And this is Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. She's a Harvard professor emeritus. She studied the business model that is now really turning our world upside down. This is an emergency intervention. So what can you do? Everything you can think of. This is the moment, this is it, right? Let's go back to what the values are. Filipinos showed the world exactly how important democracy is. And it triggered movements all around the world. So I guess the question here is, we have to ask ourselves the question of how important are the values of democracy? How important are facts? And then we have to come together and actually do something about it now.
Okay. Maraming salamat, Maria Ressa.
Nice to see you guys again.
Bye, Maria.
Maraming salamat. Now, before we continue, ako po humihingi ng paumanhin. We have this one comment, just to acknowledge the comment. We're heading into the home stretch of this discussion, but Robert Alejandro, among other people, and Timothy Dulgime are saying, but kayo English ng English, mag-Tagalog din naman kayo. And really, but I want to acknowledge this also. Hindi naman po sa kaya ko mag-Tagalog dire-diretso and all of our panelists. But on the one hand, this is an issue for media, di ba? Parang a lot of mainstream media is in fact in English. On the other hand, Jing, in everybody's defense, you look at the most powerful voices being broadcast out there. ABS-CBN did make a very conscious pioneering effort and very deliberate decision to go Tagalog. I remember when all newscasts were in English. But let's talk about that, and by way of picking up also on the impact of having lost the regional stations and the regional news programs of ABS-CBN. Just talk a bit quickly about the importance of understanding and meeting our audience where they are and speaking in the language that they do.
That was really a big part of the concept of building bridges on the air by the late Capitan Henny Lopez, Roby. It was very successful. We put up regional stations in many areas in the provinces, from Luzon to Mindanao, and for a time we had more than 20 local TV patrols. Of course, cost cutting and other efficiency issues forced us to cut down on them in recent years. However, the usefulness and the value of those local TV patrols could not be discounted. Now, with the shutdown, of course, we had to close down those stations. We had to lay off most of the people who worked in the regions. But here is the thing, no? Sabi mo nga, talagang nandoon yung kagustuhan. Once a journalist, always a journalist, and they can't really turn their backs on their communities. And what they're doing now is continuing, some of them are continuing to put up Facebook accounts so that they can still continue to deliver news to their communities. For our part in the Manila headquarters, we engaged these regional reporters as freelance contributors so that they still get to file stories about their communities, and the rest of the country can still watch those stories. So hindi namin gusto na talagang mawala yung aming provincial and regional coverage, kaya naman pinagpapatuloy namin. Of course, iba na ang terms ng engagement kapag ganyan, ano? Kung freelancer ka, alam ito ni Jim sa AP at John also. We are used to dealing with freelancers, hindi ba? But kahit pa paano nakakatulong yan para ipagpatuloy nila ang kanilang journalism, and at the same time, hindi mawala yung mga balita nang gagaling sa mga probinsya, Robbie.
Okay. Sheila, gusto kong balikan yung ika nga, di ba? You remember that? Nag-uusap tayo. You were telling me about all of these young journalists, and they want to help, they want to fight, they want to push back, but they start with a very, very basic question. Well, and it was really in the context of organizing. I mean, that was the sense that I got. So, even short of organizing, just getting together. There, among other things, Inday Espina Barona and Weng Paraan and JJ Jimeno, we've gotten together maybe 3 times during COVID, just for donuts and coffee, and it was just a time to get together and exhale and kwentuhan lang. But there was real value there, knowing that we all knew why we needed to exhale. That, Sheila, I wanted to get back to that original idea that you had. I mean, what can we do in terms of just getting together and really rebuilding and reassuring this community?
So kami ni na John, Nery, Sina Weng, and other people, we met with si Howie Severino sa GMA. We started meeting with mga young journalists from all over, print, broadcast, web. Actually, birthday namin yun tatlo kaming may birthday noon, and we said, sige, we will treat you around, John, mga 80, no? Mga 18 dumating doon sa very crowd. 16 dumating doon sa very crowd. Tapos tinanong nila, anong ginawa niyo noon nung panahon nila? Talagang matanda na kami. Ang isang sinabi namin, alam mo noon, pagkatapos ng deadline, pupunta kami sa press club.
That's right.
Tapos, inom kami ng San Miguel beer, isang beer lang noon. Kakain kami at magkukwentuhan kami, yung mga mas matanda sa amin, kaming mga bata, makikinig kami. Tapos panahon yun ni Marcos, naggrabe yung censorship, lalong-lalo na pagkatapos ng assassination ni Ninoy Aquino. Tapos talagang heart to heart na pag-uusap. Natatandaan ko pa, sabi nung isang editor sa akin, editor siya noon ng Daily Express, sabi niya, alam mo yung anak ko, kinahihiya niya na ang tatay niya ay editor na isang dyaryo. Kasi grabe yung censorship, lalo na ng Marcos Controlled Press. So talagang over a bottle of beer, mag-iiyakan kayo, pero you build community that way, solidarity, and knowing each other and building trust. So ngayon kasi, ang traffic ng Metro Manila, ang hirap na magkita-kita sa isang lugar, tapos may COVID pa. Pero ang alam ko na dyan, nagtuloy sila, no, bago nitong COVID, nagtuloy sila ng nagkikita, kasi nung bumalik ako nung last Christmas, nagpunta pa ako doon sa isang meeting nila, minsan mag-share sila ng pizza or kung saan-saan. Pero maganda yon, lalong-lalo na pag yung mas matatanda at saka yung mga bata, nagsasama-sama at nag-uusap at nag-share, kahit walang konkretong kinalabasan. I think parang we are a tribe, right? So we have to get together and be.
Speaking of that tribe, I want to give the young people an idea here because they can't picture it. They literally cannot picture it. But before, I remember, hindi lang sa periodista. Tanda ko, kahit sa mga estudyante, pagka mag-rally kayo sa harap ng US Embassy or kung saan man sa Maynila, ang isang basic na usapan, kung ma-disperse, tatakbo tayo sa National Press Club. Tapos napakalaking bagay nun. No? It created this image of may sandigan ka. Merong nasa likod mo. And that's the press. That's the media. Now, I won't get into anong nangyari sa National Press Club. Pero Jim, I do want to get into how do we bring back yung saysay ng pagiging isang komunidad, isang tribo, gaya nga nasabi ni Sheila. Oo, napakadaling mag-Zoom. This is a very big thing. Maraming salamat sa Daang Docu. Madaling mag-chat, madaling gumawa ng mga Viber group, and so on. Pero anong gusto mong mangyari, or even a simple suggestion of what can we do in terms of getting together, literally getting together?
Yeah. Robbie, in my mind, I think there's a crucial need for all efforts, like what Sheila's done a long time ago, to be institutionalized and expanded and sustained. Gabi Tabunyar and Teddy Benigno founded the FOCAP, Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines, in 1974, nearly 50 years ago, because they didn't want to be the whole, umbrella holders of Imelda Marcos. They wanted independence. And Sheila founded PCIJ in, was it 1989?
89, yeah.
Yeah, and Maria and her friends, Glenda and Chai, started Rappler 2011, 2012. So look at the longevity, look at what they're doing now. Look at the pushback, look at the potential of these networks of safety net networks. You can use this network to bring in trainings to reporters in the communities, interactions, discussions, things like this. So I think it's very important to institutionalize. And
John,
whatever effort, we have to institutionalize and to make it long lasting and organized.
John, pakisabi nga, kailan ba birthday mo? Para pwede tayo magtipon-tipon ulit.
Hindi ako yun, sina Sheila yun. But I'd like to join the conversation. First, few quick descriptions of reality. Yes, I think that the young ones have continued to meet. That's first. Second, I follow many of them on social media, and it seems like even up to now, there is a sense of solidarity or a common spirit that you can trace. I mean, that maybe it's just I'm just misreading it, but I actually think that their relationships are developing. And third, there are certain things like the campus journalism group started by Regine Cabato, Washington Post reporter for the Philippines. They've reached, I think they've had 3 or 4 workshops with campus journalists who would like to make a career out of journalism. So you have these initiatives going on. So there is that. But one of the things that we can do, well, it would be great if we can have a publication or an news organization where we can do collaborative journalism. Wouldn't it be great if we have, for instance, a magazine where a GMA reporter and an ABS-CBN reporter work on the same story, share a byline? I mean, that sort of collaborative journalism will go a long way, will encourage others to also share. I mean, you have to admit, even up to today, there's still too many boundaries, corporate boundaries that we have to observe, even among friends. So that's one thing that I would really like to see happen.
But even among the two friends here, Inquirer, for example, and ABS-CBN, are there those restrictions to your journalists to collaborating with somebody else from another company?
For some reason, it was never broached or pursued, no? But I don't really think there are restrictions. I mean, wala naman talagang bawal, di ba? But I think, Robbie, ang mahirap lang talaga yung media solidarity. It's really, really hard to achieve in the Philippine setting. I guess it's the competition that was prevalent before, but now I don't know. Are we still in competition with the mainstream media organizations? I'm not sure.
I think we are still in competition. I think the real question is, can we get together on the big things? Can we get together on the things that really confront all of us at an existential level? What do you think, Sheila and Jim?
I think it's a very narrow view to think that we are each other's competitors, because the real competition out there are the armies of disinformation and propaganda.
Exactly.
And if you look at the numbers of journalists all around the world, including here in the US, PR people outnumber journalists already. I'm sure that's the case in the Philippines also. If you take all the PRs and the communications people, there are more of us. It's really an asymmetrical fight, and that does not include the paid trolls and the people doing disinformation and the sort of semi-clandestine PR operations, especially during campaigns. So the real competition actually is not among ourselves as journalists. The real competition are the people out there who want to manipulate the news and manipulate public opinion. Right? So we should reframe our thinking in terms of competition.
The real competition are the Parlades and the Partosas of this world, I guess.
No, but I did want to say, John, I mean, ako rin, yun din yung perception ko that actually people assume, di ba? But I have yet to hear of somebody suggesting I want to initiate, maybe for lack of that initiative, but I didn't get that sense. Now, as you know, plugging, as you know, I've created a podcasting group. But from the very start, I knew that one thing that Puma Podcast can provide is a platform that nobody sees as a competition, because nobody else is doing it, diba? And therefore, when we create it, by definition, we're a friend, we're a platform to everyone. And as you know, John, we produce the podcast for Inquirer now. We produce our own investigative podcast on the war on drugs. I would please encourage everyone, please listen to Tokhang sa Tokhang on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you podcast. But here's the point: for that project, a 6-parter investigative podcast on the war on drugs, Tokhang sa Tokhang, we spoke with journalists from all over the media sector, and nobody said to us, teka muna, hindi tayo, parang magkaiba tayo ng company. Everybody was just in on the mission of telling a story.
Yeah, that's not what I meant, Rob. I meant like sharing bylines, actually working on something together. Part of the reason is because we don't really have like a Columbia Journalism Review, where we can all see as common or neutral ground. But I really like the way you have put together the Puma podcast group. So that might be a common ground for us to work together. So for instance, instead of just one newspaper looking at their archives, at their coverage of a particular controversy, you can have 2 or 3 reporters from that time talking about their experience covering that particular controversy. Rob, let me just say this though, that the meeting that we had, the first meeting that we had with the young journalists, one of the main reasons for convening that was to discuss what we could do. It wasn't for them. It wasn't to create an opportunity for the younger ones to ask us. In fact, it was the exact opposite. What we wanted to happen was, we wanted to let people know that while some of the problems look the same, the conditions are different. And perhaps what we need are digital social media natives like them to actually show the way. Now, the person behind Editors of Manila must have been there. So let me just look through my list of the names. And he misunderstood us. And he tweeted that the old guard was leaving it up to the young ones to figure out a way. And that really misrepresents the interaction. I mean, it really, we might have ideas, but who knows? They might have better ideas about how to resolve all of this. I mean, we need an AOC to think of a game changer like get out the vote on Twitch by playing Among Us. I mean, that would never have occurred to me, Rob. So, you know, it's really for the likes of Regine Cabato, Lian Buan, Mike Navalny.
Okay, Jim, what do you think we should be? What do you think we can do? And by way of bridging this generation as well, I don't know. I don't necessarily think, John, you're suggesting there's a generation gap there. But Jim, how do we bring the strengths and the experience of the old guard, let's call us that, and the new vanguards of journalism? We've been talking about collaborating across sectors. Let's talk about coming together as across generations.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, no, in the transfer of, if you may call it, technology transfer across divides, no, in the media industry. You have journalists based in Metro Manila, in the urban centers, that have a lot of access to a lot of things, tutorials and everything. So now that we've discovered the potentials of Zoom, linking up, and even if we return to normal, there can be a hybrid of keep communications between our colleagues in the provinces and those in Metro Manila. I think there's a lot of potential for technology transfer. I would think that Shiela has been doing this in the past. A lot of materials for investigative journalism. Theories about journalism, new trends in Columbia University, which is the best school for journalists in the world. And what if we can get that, to cross from Shiela to us and to a lot more in our veterans, colleagues in the countryside. In the AP, we're our job is pretty much set. No, I can't think of what collaborations we're doing, but we have stringers and. Like in the AP newsroom, we have very good books about, writing and writing style, writing principles. And I've shared this with a lot of our media friends, and they're really great materials. I think, there can be a harnessing of these networks. No?
Jim, if I may ask, Rob, if I may ask Jim, would you in AP be open to, for instance, serving as a mentor to a young journalist or even a campus journalist By mentoring, I mean like working on a particular story. So you see it develop from the pitch all the way to the finished product, which will be published elsewhere, not through AP. Is that something that is legally open to you?
Yeah, in AP we have a stewardship program. It's formal. It's quite complicated, but I'm really open to talking to people, learning from them as well. And Manny Mogato is a professor in one of the journalism schools in Manila.
That's right.
He sends his like one class load of students, journalism students, often before COVID to AP and I think to the other wire agencies. So we tour them around. We give them a lay of the office, the things that we do, particular situations. Of course, they always ask us. No, the first question always is how much is the salary in the AP. But we're open. Filipinos, including journalists, are a very generous lot. So we share a lot. We compete. Manny and my friend Jason. We're very good friends. We share a lot of things, and we share to others. In very hard coverages that we've done in Mindanao, the front lines, and during Typhoon Yolanda, I really appreciated going beyond the competition lines and sharing things and resources. And much so, I want to see more of that, cooperation and exchanges between the urban-based, NCR-based journalists and our community reporters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and certainly I think that's the thing. I mean, after this, tomorrow when we wake up, hopefully there is that thinking na, why don't we just get together? And let's see, usap lang, kape lang, di ba? Or beer lang. Kung kanino man tumapat yung birthday, thank you na lang. Diba? But we're about to wind down. I want to end with that. Sheila, what would each and every one of you want to see starting tomorrow? What's a small thing that we can do? Not something big like asking for, but because we've tackled a lot of big things already. But let's end with something small from each of you. What's one small thing we can do to help Philippine journalism?
I think for me, it's new forms of storytelling that will help advance, people's knowledge and information. So I think if we've hosted meetings, journalists are already meeting together, maybe journalists and some artists meeting together on potential collaborative projects.
Okay. John?
I was going to say something, but I forgot. I lost my train of thought. So maybe a better memory for the old guard. Can you get back to me, Rob?
Sige. Ging muna, Ging.
Robbie, what struck me these past few months is that media people, journalists like ourselves, have become closer somehow. I mean, how many Zoom and webinars have we attended since the pandemic or since the franchise issue of ABS-CBN, di ba? Parang madaming naging karamay ang ABS-CBN and even Rappler in our respective issues. And I think journalists have started to realize that it's time we work together, or that it's time we started showing real solidarity. The other thing is that this crisis that we're facing is forcing us to reinvent ourselves. Madami sa atin. Can you imagine those regional journalists of ABS-CBN banding together to form a group to try to fund their own Facebook news show or YouTube news show, diba? So it's fueling reinvention somehow. And I think one small thing that I can do perhaps to help improve our profession is really to continue, or when I when I go to the newsroom on Monday, I probably would take stock of the young journalists, the young promising ones in ABS-CBN that I think would be able to help propagate the values, the best practices that we have, and turn those into something that we can work on. Whether it's a long form program, whether it's a talk show among us, whether it's a regular gathering or a webinar, just so the old guard and the young ones, the millennials or the Gen Zs, can really work together to get us out of this morass. Brainstorm, drink, talk.
Until pigilan kayo, wag kayo magpapapigil. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, Rob, let's give Jim the last word. So I'll go next. No, two things. I wish more of us can follow the example of Philstar News in contextualizing social media posts. They've done this for the last couple of years, and they've gotten really good at it. This addresses one of the concerns of Shiela, that we are able to contextualize. We are able to read contextualized news as news breaks. And the second thing is, I'd like more of us to follow the example of Ed Yong. So if you read Atlantic, Ed Yong is probably the best writer in the world right now covering the pandemic. But one of the thing that he practices that really impresses me is that whenever a big article of his comes out, he would thank the editors who work with him and other reporters, and then he would point out other stories by other journalists belonging to other outlets. And it really just develops a wider web. It's like, okay, we're all covering this thing. This is my take, but you can, please also read A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And that would be great if we can also do that as a matter of habit.
Sure.
Okay. Jim.
Rob, for me, it's a message, a very basic message. We face a lot of threats, libel, and everything, harassment. I think the best defense for me, for all the journalists in this country is your story. I think the story should be like empirically solid and watertight, and it can stand in any court. It can stand any harassment. It's a guard against fake news. So there are a lot of ways to do that. We are seeing new generations of journalists, and I'm very impressed with a lot of them. So yeah, and the situation hasn't changed. The political system. Let us cover this country well. It's a breathtaking country to cover. The conflicts in Mindanao, the potential of Mindanao, and this COVID crisis. But the bottom line really is doing your job well and make every story don't release it unless you're very sure of it, and imbibe all the trainings, the skills that you can. There are a lot of resources now. Journalists are sharing. The internet is a very good teacher. The streets are a good teacher. There are still weaknesses in this regard, but really I've worked in the Inquirer. I've worked with the Japanese news agencies, and now with this Western agency, and yeah, there really has to be a major effort every time before you put out that story. And in relation to that, there has to be an editorial system that can catch any weakness, and any weak story. We have our low days and weak days, and it should be caught. So I think in this sense, we are better protected against libel, in other forms of harassment, because the threats have always been there. It is here, and it will bury us. I hope not literally,
Okay.
Rob, if I may, I think it is important for us to focus on questions of craft and professional solidarity, but I think it is equally important to also remember our historical situation. So if you will allow me, I will just repeat what I said earlier, that this is not just another administration. There were problems with Aquino, Ramos, Estrada, Arroyo, Aquino, but none of them turned authoritarian. Duterte is turning authoritarian following the template of Marcos. I would like to quote the distinguished former journalist and esteemed communications professor, Crispin Maslog, formerly of Agence France Presse. In a forum on challenging times for journalists, he stood up and said, "The president is the challenge." I think we should remember that is our particular historical situation.
Okay. Maraming salamat, John. And in the meantime, journalism, however you want to see it, is journalism. The journalists you see around you are the same journalists who are going to be there tomorrow and years from now. I can certainly say that for our friends, our mentors, our models, our idols who joined us in this conversation. I mean, I was asked once in a forum in a school. Na basically, the question was, these people that we look up to, what was their journey? How did they get there? And so on. Sabi ko, obviously, I can't answer for everyone, but I can tell you this much. This much is true. They're the ones who are left there. They're the ones there. I can think of a lot of people who were better writers than me, who were better writers than even the people here. I don't think anybody here will take that as a slight to say that there were a lot of people who were better writers than us. But essentially, the people you see, these are the people who stuck it out. These are the people who are still here. These are the people who found it fulfilling and basically just found honor and joy and enjoyment in this craft. We hope you will find that for yourselves too, because that will define not just the state, but the future of journalism in the Philippines. And with that, we'd like to thank very much our guests, Shiela Coronel, John Nery, Maria Ressa, Ging, and Jim Gomez of Associated Press. Maraming salamat to everyone. Thank you, of course, to Cara Magcano Caligpala and everybody behind the Ang Docu. This is a fantastic platform. Pagpalain po kayo, mabuhay kayo. Please keep it going. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to our discussion. Maraming pasensya na po na hindi kami nagtagalog. At I admit that that's a fault. And that's something that it's a habit that we have to also be conscious of, not just in ourselves, but in this thing that we're trying to do as we connect with our people. A recording of this conversation will be available online. I believe we will be flashing the link there. Certainly, you will find it on the Ang Docu. I'd also like to thank the students who have been watching, students from De La Salle University, Miriam College, Ateneo University, University of Santo Tomas, University of the Philippines Diliman, University of the Philippines Visayas, Mapua University, Cavite State University, Bulacan State University, College of St. Benilde, St. Scholastica's College, CEU High School, St. Mary's College, the Journalism Guild of Polytechnic University of the Philippines, Journalism Guild, San Carlos University, Centro Escolar University High School. Now catch all the documentaries of the Ang Docu streaming all day until November 5. All of these are free of charge on theangdocu.com/what. Now, para pong tokhang sa tokhang ng Puma Podcast, libre rin po yan sa Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast. No, but I'm really very proud of it. Can I just say, can I brag that Tokhang sa Tokhang, our 6-part documentary series, is the first Filipino podcast, and as far as we know, the first Asian podcast to be curated by the U.S. Library of Congress for inclusion in the podcast preservation project of the U.S. Library of Congress. So that is officially there as official resource for research in the future. So please, by all means, let's support each other, let's support me. Ang dokumentaryo po ay paglalahad ng mga istoryang halaw sa totoo. Pero sa huli, tayo rin at walang iba ang magsusulat ng ating kwento. Ako po si Roby Alampay for the Ang Docu. Maraming salamat po for joining. Keep streaming on the Ang Docu, the home of Philippine documentary. Sa ngalan po ni Cara Magcano Caligpala. Maraming salamat po. Magandang gabi. Mabuhay po kayong lahat.